I used to think my neighborhood was a paradise. It had the white picket fences, the manicured lawns, and that quiet, suburban hum that makes you feel like you've finally made it. But as anyone who has lived under a homeowners association knows, paradise usually comes with a price, and mine came in the form of a woman named Margaret. Margaret was the kind of person who didn't just follow the rules. She weaponized them. She was the president of our HOA, and she treated the neighborhood like her own personal kingdom. I mostly stayed out of her way, working from my home office as a freelance software developer, until the day she decided that my internet connection was a violation of community standards. It started with a knock on the door that was far too rhythmic to be friendly. When I opened it, Margaret was standing there with a clipboard and a look of practiced disappointment. She didn't say hello. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward the side of my house, where a small, discreet satellite dish was mounted near the roofline. I had installed it because the local cable provider was notoriously unreliable, and for my job, a high-speed, dedicated backup was a necessity. She told me the dish was an eyesore, and that the board had voted to ban all external communication equipment that wasn't pre-approved. I tried to explain that it was essential for my livelihood, but she just smiled that thin, cold smile and told me I had 48 hours to remove it or face daily fines. That night, I sat in my office, looking at the glowing blue lights of my router, feeling a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. It wasn't just about the dish. It was about the control. Margaret had spent years slowly stripping away the small joys of the residents here. She'd banned bird feeders because they attracted pests, prohibited certain types of outdoor holiday lights, and even tried to regulate the exact shade of beige we were allowed to paint our front doors. People were miserable, but they were also afraid. The fines were heavy, and the legal threats were constant. I realized then that if I gave in, I wasn't just losing my internet. I was handing over the keys to my own home. That I decided to do some digging. I spent the next few days poring over the HOA bylaws, some of which hadn't been updated since the late 90s. I was looking for a loophole, something that could protect my right to work. What I found was something much bigger. While I was researching the telecommunications acts that protect satellite dish installations, I stumbled upon the financial filings for our association. As a homeowner, I had the right to view them, though Margaret made it as difficult as possible to actually get my hands on the documents. When I finally received the digital copies, I stayed up until 3 in the morning looking at the numbers. The math didn't add up. There were massive maintenance fees paid out to a landscaping company that didn't seem to exist. There were legal retainers for a firm that was actually owned by Margaret's brother-in-law. But the biggest red flag was the Community Improvement Fund. Tens of thousands of dollars had been moved into an account designated for a new clubhouse. As I connected the dots, never built. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't just a story about a mean lady who hated satellite dishes. This was a story about systemic greed and a woman who was using her power to bankroll a lifestyle the rest of us were unknowingly subsidizing. That I knew I couldn't just walk into her office and accuse her. She was too smart for that. I needed to wait for the annual board meeting, which was conveniently scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the fines started piling up. Every morning, a new slip of paper was tucked into my door. $50, $100, $200. Margaret would drive by in her white SUV, slowing down just enough to look at the dish still perched on my roof, her expression one of smug triumph. She thought she was winning. She thought I was just another resident who would eventually fold under the pressure. The night of the meeting arrived. The community center was packed with tired-looking neighbors who were used to being lectured about their grass height. Margaret stood at the front, looking every bit the queen bee in her power suit. She started the meeting by publicly shaming me, bringing up my unauthorized equipment as an example of the deteriorating standards of the neighborhood. She asked me if I had anything to say before the board voted to place a lien on my property for the unpaid fines. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my voice was steady. I didn't mention the dish. Not at first. Instead, I pulled out a stack of folders. I started talking about the landscaping company. I watched as the color slowly drained from Margaret's face. I mentioned the brother-in-law's law firm. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop as I projected the financial discrepancies onto the wall behind her using my own portable projector. Connected, ironically, to the very internet she was trying to ban. The neighbors began to murmur. Then the murmurs turned into shouts. People who had been quiet for years were suddenly standing up, demanding answers about where their monthly dues were actually going. Margaret tried to gavel us into silence, but she had lost control. The mask of the concerned neighbor had slipped, revealing the panicked face of someone who had been caught red-handed. I handed over a thumb drive to the board's treasurer, a man who had always been a bit of a pushover but looked genuinely horrified by what he was seeing on the screen. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. The meeting was adjourned, but the investigation was just beginning. Over the next month, the truth came out in waves. It wasn't just a few $1,000s. It was a sophisticated scheme that had been going on for nearly a decade. Margaret wasn't just removed from the board. She was facing a massive civil lawsuit and potential criminal charges for embezzlement. The landscaping company was indeed a shell corporation, and the clubhouse fund had been used to pay for her frequent vacations and a luxury car that was parked 3 blocks away in a rented garage. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. It was as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. We held an emergency election and voted in a group of people who actually cared about the community, not the power. The first order of business for the new board was to strike down the ridiculous restrictions on bird feeders. They also sent me a formal apology letter and a check for every single cent of the fines I had paid, plus interest. But the most meaningful part of the whole ordeal wasn't the money or the satellite dish. It was the afternoon a few weeks later when my neighbor from 3 doors down, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, walked over to my house. He had been one of the people Margaret had bullied the most, nearly forcing him to sell his home because he couldn't afford the fines for his unauthorized rose bushes. He handed me a small box of homemade cookies and just looked at me for a moment with misty eyes. He told me that for the first time in years, he felt like he actually lived in a home again, not a prison. As I watched him walk back to his garden, I realized that Margaret's biggest mistake wasn't the embezzlement or the power trip. Her mistake was forgetting that a neighborhood isn't made of rules and regulations. It's made of people. She thought that by controlling our surroundings, she could control us. She didn't expect that by trying to cut off my connection to the world, she would end up connecting the entire neighborhood against her. I still have that satellite dish on my roof. It's a little weathered now, and I probably don't even need it as a backup anymore, but I keep it there as a reminder. It reminds me that sometimes you have to stand your ground, not just for yourself, but for the people standing behind you who haven't found their voice yet. The quiet hum of the neighborhood is still there, but now it feels different. Feels like peace, not silence. And as for Margaret, she moved away shortly after the legal proceedings began. I don't know where she went, but I hope wherever she is, she's learned that you can't build a kingdom on a foundation of fear, because eventually someone is going to start looking at the blueprints. Standing up to an HOA isn't just about winning a fight. It's about reclaiming the sense of belonging that everyone deserves in their own home. It took a lot of stress and a few sleepless nights, but seeing my neighbors smile again made every second of it worth it. We aren't just a list of addresses on a map anymore. We're a community that looks out for one another, and that is something no amount of bylaws or fines can ever take away.